Serious. What is the most successful lie in history? I acknowledge that I have read and agree to the above terms and conditions. One that we'll never know was a lie. It says here in this history book that, luckily, the good guys have won every single time. What are the odds? Norm Macdonald. That fat is harmful to your diet. That was just false information. And by trying to replace fats with sugar, obesity became an epidemic. In the 90s, kids spread the rumor that Marilyn Manson had a rib removed so he could suck his own DCK. We spread this rumor across the entire country without the use of cell phones or the Internet. Iceland and Greenland. Frank Abagnale Jr., the inspiration for Catch Me If You Can, apparently wasn't as big of a conman that the movie leads you to believe. He conned people into thinking he was a bigger con man than he actually was. Some tech for background. Have you ever heard of a radar detector? How about a radar detector, which the police use to see if you have a detector? Ever wonder how they work? I mean, a radar detector is a receiver. How could the police possibly know you have one? Until recently, practically every radio used a concept called superheterodyne. Basically, there's a tiny radio transmitter in your receiver. That signal is mixed with the one from the antenna and the result is what your receiver tunes to. It's one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. And you most likely never heard of it. Poor Ed. All he got for his work was jumping out a window to his death. The problem is that sometimes the tiny transmitter is poorly shielded and some of it leaks back out the antenna. If you know what that intermediate frequency is, you can listen for it. The escort radar detectors, which were super popular in the 80s, leaked like a sieve. Presto, radar detectors. Takeaway. If you know what you're looking for, you can actually detect someone else's radio receiver. The setup in 1942, RAF planes began using VHF radar to look for German submarines leaving port in France at night. All of a sudden they were getting sunk en masse. The Germans were familiar with other British radars working around this frequency and were able to find the new radar's frequency around August. They built a receiver, METOX, which was tuned to this frequency. When a plane using this radar was anywhere in the area, METOX would play a sound into the radio operator's headphones. By October most of the fleet had it and the RAF pilots were returning with stories about how the U-boats would always dive as soon as they turned toward them to attack. But the RAF had prepared for this moment. They knew it was only a matter of time before the Germans found the frequency. Earlier, 2 grad students had come up with a new device called the magnetron that produced very strong radio signals from a device the size of a breadbox. And the signal was really short, about 10 cm, whereas their older radars were 150. So METOX was completely incapable of hearing it. It was tuned way too far from the frequency of the new signal. They rushed the new system into production and the first set started arriving just in time for the U-boat campaign. To start up again in spring when the weather got better. By March it was clear to the Germans something was up. Their boats were getting sunk en masse again. And the ones that escaped attack said there was no warning on their detectors. They tried everything to detect the new signal, but they just couldn't find it. This was because they were missing one extremely important bit of electronics, the crystal detector, and simply couldn't hear the signals no matter how hard they tried. And now the lie. Knowing something was up, U-boats were on high alert all the time. One got lucky and shot down its attacker, and captured the crew. During interrogation they asked why they could no longer detect the radar. The pilot told them they no longer used radar. Instead, he claimed, they had a receiver for METOX and under perfect conditions they could pick it up 90 miles away. They only turned on the radar at the last minute for range measurements so they knew when to drop the depth charges. By that time the U-boat was too busy exploding to notice. The Germans didn't believe him, but it was technically possible. One can indeed make a receiver to detect your receiver. And METOX was known to be leaky, as it was deliberately built quick and cheap from a pre-war French radio set. So they built their own METOX receiver in the lab, and sure enough, they could detect it. So then they put it on a plane and detected one of their boats 60 miles away. Utter panic. Orders were sent out to all boats. Turn off METOX. And so not only did the RAF get to keep using their fancy new magnetron radar without the Germans even trying to detect it, but then they turned off their perfectly good METOX detectors and all the RAF planes with the older radar suddenly started working again too. And that is the greatest lie ever. By the end of June, the U-boat fleet was on the bottom of the ocean. This was not due entirely to this trick. There were a number of things that all arrived at almost the same time that did it. It was the combination of the new radars, Huff-Duff, larger numbers of frigates dedicated to the task and the lack of any detectors on the U-boats that made even the old radars work again. All arrived within 2 months. And that was that. The Germans finally figured it out sometime around November. Apparently the pilot made the whole thing up on his own. This little white lie helped open the Atlantic to the convoys of 1943 that led to the end of Italy's involvement and ultimately D-Day. Updates. Fixed the GR.SP, added links and minor changes to satisfy the Debbie Downers. That diamonds are valuable. Made one family really rich, though lol. Gotta love how many people try to defend their artificially inflated value. Just shows how well the lie continues to work lol. I before E except after C unless your foreign neighbor Keith offers you 8 counterfeit sleighs from feisty caffeinated weightlifters. Weird. Santa Claus. Trojan horse comes to mind. There's actually not much archaeological evidence of there having been a Greek versus Trojan War at all. We know that there was a city called Troy in modern-day Turkey, but there definitely doesn't appear to be evidence that would suggest anything like a 10-year siege as described in the Iliad. Ancient Greek history is kind of interesting, because there's so much mythology and legend sprinkled through it that you know are fictional. But a lot of the events do have a nugget of truth too. But I think a lot of people assume more of it is based in reality than it actually is. That black people and watermelon are racist stereotypes. The truth is that when the slaves were freed they grew and sold watermelon as a way to earn money to feed, clothe and house themselves. The watermelon was actually a symbol of freedom and self-reliance for newly freed slaves. What happened was that the former slave owners saw this and started a propaganda campaign to turn white people away from buying food as they called it. It's probably one of the earliest examples of the press manipulating the truth for its owners. This is where the big lips and eating like animals pictures came from. When black people started selling chickens, the same thing happened. Only this time it came in movie form. The black people and fired chicken thing started in Birth of a Nation, the racist as fuck KKK movie. What should be symbols of freedom and self-reliance to a people struggling after centenaries of slavery were twisted into symbols of shame. So much so that 100 years later they are both still seen with negative connections. That lobbying isn't just bribery with extra steps. We are using mass surveillance to help catch terrorists. It's not you, it's me.